The wind blew harder that night than anyone in the valley could remember. It howled like a wounded beast across the flats, driving sheets of snow against cabin walls, ripping shingles from roofs, forcing shut every door it could reach, and rattling those it couldn't. And yet no one lit a lantern for the orphans in the barn. They were just the Pike kids, after all. No last names anyone cared to remember, no family but each other, no one to defend them when the cold began to settle and the gossip turned mean. Their mother had died birthing the last one, and their father had vanished some time after, headed west or hanged, depending who you asked. They'd been living inside an old hay barn on the edge of town ever since, just far enough out that folks didn't have to see them unless they made a trip out for feed or firewood. And lately, nobody was making trips. There were 4 of them. Caleb was the oldest, nearly 15, tall for his age but bone thin from a year of scraping by on stale biscuits and whatever root vegetables he could barter off the back of wagons. He'd once had a soft look to him, but that winter had carved all of it away. Next came Anna, just turned 11, but already shouldering more than most grown women. She cooked, sewed, boiled water over a rusted iron stove barely big enough for a kettle, and when the others cried at night, which the littlest still did, she'd hum like their mother used to, soft and low, until it was quiet again. Then there was Jonah, 7 years old and desperate to prove he wasn't the baby anymore. And finally Ruthie, who had barely learned to walk before their mother passed, and hadn't spoken since. The barn was a drafty old shell left behind by a man who died 5 winters back. Its loft sagged like tired shoulders, and its doors no longer shut right, but it was dry, and that alone made it valuable. The town council had told them it wasn't fit for lodging, but they hadn't exactly offered anything else. So the orphans stayed, and the town watched, and nobody did a damn thing until the snow came so hard it took the fences down. The blizzard wasn't supposed to hit so soon. Old men at the saloon had said the early cold snap would break by week's end. Just a scare, they'd muttered, clinking glasses and talking about trapping roots come spring. But the storm came with a vengeance, the kind that didn't care about forecasts or fence posts. It swept in over the mountain like a punishment. By the time it struck the town proper, every road was gone beneath snow, and the wind was so loud no one heard the first cabin collapse. But the barn held, because Caleb had been ready in ways no one saw coming. He'd spent months shoring up the walls with mud and clay, patching gaps between planks with straw soaked and pressed tight into every crevice. He'd bartered for every tool he didn't have, worked for every pail of tar and lard, hauling logs for men who refused to say thank you, chopping kindling for women who wouldn't meet his eye. All summer long, he'd walked the fields barefoot just to save the soles of his shoes, and he'd used the leather to seal a hole in the roof. They'd found old horse blankets in the stable, and Anna had stitched them into thick curtains that hung like meat over the windows, blocking wind and trapping warmth. Caleb even dug a trench around the foundation and filled it with stones to stop the melt from seeping in come spring. The barn looked the same from the outside, crooked, grey, pitiful, and that's all the townsfolk saw. But inside, it had become something else entirely, a place that could survive. The fire in the old stove never went out, not once. Caleb had watched the way smoke behaved in cold weather, and how it rose thicker when the flue was clean, so he scrubbed it every 2 weeks whether it needed it or not. They burned cow patties, sticks, and sometimes boots too torn to wear. Every bit of heat was sacred. They slept in shifts beside the stove, rotating places so no one ever got too cold or too hot. Anna learned how to stew acorns into bitter soup. Jonah built a bed from hay bales and lined it with wax paper so it wouldn't draw damp. Ruthie clung to a rag doll whose eyes were just buttons and somehow never cried anymore. She just watched, silent, always watching. People laughed at them, even as the cold deepened, called them barn rats, hay mice, scavengers, said they'd be dead by February, but nobody stopped them. Nobody asked what they needed. Nobody gave them wood or boots or meat. One man offered to take Anna off their hands. Caleb bloodied his nose so badly he lost 2 teeth. After that, the offers stopped, and so did the little charity that had existed. It was better that way, safer. Then came the night the town blacked out. They'd called it just another cold snap. But around midnight, the wind turned mean. It slammed into town like it had teeth, tearing shingles, some cracking beams, peeling walls from frames. Chimneys failed, stoves went out. The snow piled so fast doors couldn't be opened. Men with rifles stood helpless in their doorways as roofs buckled under the weight. Mothers smothered babies under blankets, praying for dawn. But it didn't come, and neither did help. By morning, 3 houses had caved in. A dozen families had fled to the church, and some were wandering the streets, faces black with frostbite, children wrapped in feed sacks, no shoes on their feet. The general store had burned when the chimney failed. So had the mill. Then the mayor's own home cracked clean in half when the old oak tree beside it gave way, splitting his living room wide open like a rotten egg. And in the distance, standing silent and squat beneath the white sky, was the barn. No smoke came from it. No footprints led to or from its doors. It looked abandoned, forgotten, like a carcass in the snow. But inside, the orphans were alive. More than that, they were warm, because that morning, as the wind howled over the ruined cabins, Caleb cracked open the stove door and fed it 2 strips of wood cut from the rafters he'd reinforced months earlier. Extras, stored just in case. Then he turned to Anna, nodded once, and they began boiling water. By the time footsteps came crunching through the snow outside, slow, hesitant, ashamed, the barn's interior smelled of soup, bitter acorn, and dried onion. The windows were fogged with warmth, and the children didn't rise. They waited, because they knew what those knocks on the door really meant. Not curiosity, not kindness, desperation. When the first knock came at the barn door, Caleb didn't answer, not because he hadn't heard it. He had. All 4 children had. The thump against the wood was weak, muffled by gloves, or maybe just hands too frozen to make sound. Then another. Then silence. Caleb sat still on the hay-covered floor, legs crossed beside the stove, his hands slowly stirring the pot. The water hadn't even boiled yet, and he wasn't about to let cold air undo the hours of precious heat they'd built. "Wait," he said without looking up. Anna sat behind him, her back to the stove, a quilt around Ruthie in her lap. "They'll come again?" Caleb added. They did. 10 minutes passed, then another knock, this one harder. 2 taps and a rasp of a voice, too dry to tell if it belonged to a man or a woman. "Help, please." Caleb rose, wiped his hands on his patched pants, and walked to the door. He stood just beside it so the wind wouldn't cut in when he opened it. He counted to 3, once, slowly, then through the latch. Snow slammed in like it was angry at being denied. It spilled across the floor, stinging bare feet. The wind roared, and for a second the cold reached in like a claw. But then Caleb pulled, hard, and the door thudded shut again behind the shape that stumbled inside. It was a boy, older than Caleb, maybe 17 or 18, wrapped in a blanket so thin it looked like gauze. His lips were split open from the cold, one cheek raw with windburn, his hands red as brick. He didn't speak, he didn't have to. He just looked around, blinking slow, and started crying. Not loud, just tears running down his swollen face, steaming on his cheeks in the warmth. Anna rushed forward and grabbed Ruthie to shield her from the cold, while Caleb helped the boy to a corner near the stove. Jonah said nothing, just stared, wide-eyed, as the door rattled from the wind. That was the first. By noon, 6 more had come. One family of 3, parents and their daughter, had been found buried in a snowdrift. The mother's hand had been black to the wrist. The daughter wouldn't stop shivering, even as Anna wrapped her in 2 quilts and pressed her near the stove. A woman from the church came next, half frosted, half hysterical, muttering about how God turned his back on this town. The barn held them all. Caleb didn't sleep that night, neither did Anna. They took turns feeding the stove, checking for cracks in the walls, tightening blankets, keeping the little ones quiet as more people came knocking. By dawn, there were 16 bodies in the barn, most alive, 2 dead. One man passed in his sleep, the frost in his lungs too thick to breathe. The other was a girl no older than Jonah, already blue when they carried her in. Caleb didn't have it in him to tell her parents, but Anna whispered it gently before morning broke. They cried in silence. By the second day, the barn had become something it had never meant to be, a haven, a last stop, an insult to every man who mocked it. The warmth inside was undeniable. The stove glowed hot, kept alive by the cords of wood Caleb had hidden behind the false wall he'd built into the stall. They burned low and slow, rationing the logs as carefully as any food. Jonah and a surviving father took turns grinding acorns into paste. The woman from the church cleaned snow off the boots of every new arrival and helped patch blankets from torn shirts. By the 3rd night, the barn had over 20 souls inside, and not a single one of them had come to help the orphans before. It wasn't lost on Anna. She watched them closely, the way they shuffled, begged, crouched beside the heat like it was owed to them, the way none of them made eye contact with Caleb, as if admitting his presence might force them to acknowledge who saved them. Anna didn't hate them, not quite, but she didn't forget either. She had sewn their pity into her stitches for years, and now she sewed her memory into every quilt she patched. Caleb said little. He moved like a man twice his age, quiet, steady, always calculating how much wood he had left, how long they could stretch the soup, how many bodies the barn could reasonably hold, before warmth started to slip out from too many mouths breathing at once. But the storm wasn't over. It howled for 6 days. By day 4, the church roof had collapsed. By day 5, the town doctor had frozen to death trying to make it across the square with a bundle of firewood. The mayor, who had once tried to run the children out for squatting, was found huddled beneath a wagon, wrapped in burlap sacks, and muttering about angels. They carried him into the barn too. He wouldn't look Caleb in the eye either, but Ruthie did. The smallest of the 4 Pike children had not spoken a word since their mother died, but now she sat curled in Anna's lap beside the fire, watching every movement. Her eyes followed Caleb as he ladled soup, as he stirred logs, as he hammered a loose board into place. She hadn't said a word until that night. There was a crash outside, the sound of wood splintering under weight. The final stable had caved. Snow poured in through a small crack high on the barn's back wall. The people inside screamed. Some scrambled toward the stove, others cowered, clutching children or blankets. Panic rose like smoke. Caleb stood still. Then Ruthie, tiny, quiet Ruthie, reached up and tugged Anna's sleeve. She whispered, just one word, trust. Anna froze. Her throat went dry. Ruthie hadn't spoken in 2 years, but the word cut through her like fire. Trust. Anna stood. Everyone sit still, she said loudly. Her voice rang clear. Caleb turned to her. She nodded. The townsfolk looked around. One man whispered, "Are we safe in here?" Another sobbed, "It's going to fall. The whole roof will go next." Anna raised her voice. "It won't. How do you know?" Someone shouted. Caleb didn't say anything. Instead, he walked to the rear of the barn, climbed the ladder to the loft, and pointed up. There, above their heads, were 4 thick beams, notched, grooved, nailed twice over and braced at angles no farmer would have wasted time on. He had done it all by hand, over months, one board at a time, sometimes in the dark, sometimes when no one was watching. The roof wasn't just patched, it was reinforced. "Because we made it so," Caleb said quietly. The silence after that was like reverence. The storm did not stop, but the fear inside the barn did. By the 6th day, when the wind finally died and the snow began to settle, the sun rose red through the frozen clouds and found the valley half buried. More than half the homes had fallen. The church was a ruin. The store was ash. Only the barn stood whole and alive. People emerged one by one, blinking, squinting, faces cracked with cold, eyes wide at the sight of a town undone. They turned and looked back, at the crooked barn, at the smoke still rising from its stove, at the children standing in the doorway, not begging, not smiling, just standing. Caleb, Anna, Jonah, and Ruthie. Orphans, yes, but not helpless, not anymore. They didn't want to go back to their homes, not even when the storm was over and the sky turned blue again, not when the snow finally stopped falling, not when the sun returned just long enough to glitter across the wreckage of a broken town. The people stayed, some out of fear, others because they had nothing left to return to. But most stayed because the barn, crooked, cold-looking and cobbled together with patched beams and mismatched walls, had kept them alive when no other structure had. They stayed because it was safe, because it was warm, because the 4 children who had once been mocked, ignored or pitied, had built something stronger than anything the grown men in town ever did. And it changed things, not all at once, not in words, but in the way people stepped lighter when they walked inside now, in the way they spoke to Caleb, or the way their eyes lingered longer on Anna, watching her move from bedroll to bedroll with quiet precision, ladling out soup, checking limbs for frostbite, singing soft when Ruthie couldn't sleep. There was shame in those eyes. And something else too, recognition. By the end of that week, the barn was a makeshift town hall, not because anyone declared it so, but because it was the only building left standing with enough space to gather, and a stove still burning at the center. And because Caleb had, without ever asking, begun organizing things. He created a rotation for firewood duty, sending able-bodied men to dig out what logs could still be scavenged beneath snowdrifts or pulled from collapsed sheds. He had Jonah mark every pile with chalk, logging what came in and what went out. Anna oversaw food, who ate what, when, and how much could be spared. She cooked without waste, boiling rinds, soaking beans, stretching flour by mixing it with acorn flour ground into powder by hand. The children became something close to authority, not because they wanted to lead, but because no one else had the strength left to. And slowly, people followed. One woman, Mrs. Tillerson, who'd lost her husband in the freeze, took over tending to wounds. She'd been a midwife once, and though her hands shook, she was the only one left who could stitch or check frostbitten fingers without panicking. A group of teenage boys began hauling snow out of the barn each morning in buckets, digging a trench to drain meltwater so it wouldn't soak their bedding. A man named Green, who had never spoken to the Pike children before the storm, began repairing old tools and even fixed the latch on the barn's main door without being asked. They never apologized, not directly, but Caleb noticed. So did Anna. Even Jonah, despite being just 7, walked a little straighter when men twice his size waited for his word before cutting a log or taking from the food stash. Still, not everyone adapted. There was always a man like Barrow. Jebediah Barrow had owned the largest house in town before the storm. 2 floors, 4 rooms, a proper chimney, and a wraparound porch. Now it was half rubble, and he'd been one of the last to come to the barn. He hadn't knocked. He'd just banged on the door and demanded to be let in. When Caleb opened it, Barrow had shoved past him without a word. He refused to work, refused to eat rationed meals, and when his voice cracked with cold, he still found the breath to mock the children. "Little Lord Caleb," he sneered one evening, watching the boy measure flour with precise fingers. "Think you run the place now, do ya?" Caleb didn't answer. Barrow laughed bitterly. "What kind of world is this when a patchwork barn and a bunch of orphans survive what grown men couldn't?" Anna stood up fast. Barrow flinched as she stepped between him and her brother. "You lost your home," she said calmly. "He built one. That's the difference." Barrow spat into the straw. "You built a coffin." That night, someone pissed in the water barrel. By morning, 2 people were sick. They never proved it was Barrow, but everyone knew. Caleb didn't raise his voice. He didn't confront the man. He simply moved the water barrel, sealed it under a quilt, and assigned Jonah to watch it. Then he posted a list near the stove, names of those who'd volunteered for wood, food, healing, or repairs. Barrow's name wasn't on it. By the next day, Barrow was gone. No one opened the door for him again. The storm had broken more than buildings. It had broken illusions about who mattered, about what made someone useful, about what a leader looked like. And the children, once treated as town burdens, were now at the center of it all. But Caleb knew it couldn't last. Not this way, because the snow would melt, and the town would want to rebuild. And people forget, always. They forget who carried them when it mattered. They rewrite stories. They talk about pulling through and coming together. And they stopped saying your name at all? Caleb watched it begin on the 9th day. Green started talking about the mill. "We could salvage the lower foundation," he said to a small group near the stove. "If we get stone from the quarry, maybe build a new base before the thaw." Mrs. Tillerson began organizing a count of survivors, writing names on a sheet of paper she'd found tucked into a hymnal. "We need to know who's still here, who's strong enough to help." Anna overheard 2 women whispering about cabins on the far side of the valley. "Maybe those held," one said. "Maybe we could move in together, make do." It wasn't wrong. Caleb knew that, but it was happening faster than he expected. They were leaving, soon, and the barn would be empty again. That night he sat by the stove long after the others slept. The fire crackled soft. Anna dozed with Ruthie curled beside her. Jonah lay with one foot sticking from the quilt, mouth open, snoring lightly. Caleb stared at the embers and listened. There was a sound beyond the wind. Footsteps. He stood, careful not to wake anyone, crossed to the door, opened it just enough to see. A boy stood outside, alone, maybe 10. His coat was torn, face raw from wind, no shoes. Behind him, nothing but snow. "Where'd you come from?" Caleb asked. The boy stared at him. "Walked," he said. "From where?" "Cabin down by the East Creek." Nobody left. Caleb stepped aside. The boy entered without another word. By morning, there were 4 more, and by noon, 3 more children had come, alone, half-frozen, hollow-eyed, survivors, ones who hadn't known where to go, ones the town had forgotten. Anna looked at Caleb and said quietly, "They'll keep coming." He nodded, because the barn wasn't just shelter now. It was something else, a sanctuary, and Caleb, whether he wanted to or not, had become its keeper. The barn didn't empty, not when the roads reopened, not when the frost loosened its grip on the valley, not even when the sky cleared for the first time in 2 weeks. And townsfolk began talking about rebuilding with half-frozen hope in their voices. The snow thawed slow, melting off rooftops like forgotten grief, but the barn stayed full, because word had spread, whispers carried by those who left in search of kin, those who dug out ruined cellars and collapsed cabins, those who passed through neighboring towns and mentioned with awe or embarrassment, the barn that had stayed standing, and the orphans who ran it. So the children kept coming, some on foot, their feet wrapped in burlap or strips of torn shirts, some carried on sleds by weeping neighbors, some walked alone for miles, past blackened chimneys and drifted fences, led only by rumor. By the end of the 2nd week after the blizzard, there were over 30 children in the barn. Caleb counted them each morning. He didn't know all their names, but he gave them tasks: sweeping, sorting firewood, feeding the chickens someone had brought in a cage 2 days ago, watering them from the melted snow they collected and stored in barrels Jonah guarded like gold. Anna taught the girls how to sew. She rationed soup like a general, never once running dry. Ruthie, still barely speaking, took to standing at the door each morning, waiting for the next knock, clutching a small blanket and handing it over without a word. The barn had changed. Again, the townsfolk who once mocked them came less often now, not because they forgot, but because they weren't needed anymore. The barn was no longer a place of desperation. It had become something separate from the town, a place where no one cursed, no one fought, and no one turned away a child for being loud or poor or broken. It had rules now, not written, but understood. Work, or help someone who does. Don't steal, don't waste food or heat, and never mock a survivor. On the 15th night, 2 older boys from the edge of town tried to take over. They were lean and mean and walked like they'd never been told no. One shoved a smaller boy aside to reach the stove. The other demanded food from Anna before the line was served. Caleb didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply took the ladle from the pot, handed it to Jonah, and stood between the stove and the older boy. "You don't eat until he does," Caleb said, pointing to a girl no older than 5 who was curled in blankets near the wall. The older boy scoffed. "She's not even working." "She walked 12 miles through snow," Caleb said. "Oh, so?" "She still stood guard this morning while we cleared snow off the roof." The other boy said nothing, just stared at Caleb, and for a second it looked like fists might fly. Then Anna stepped in, not with a weapon, but with words. "You're not the first to walk in here thinking strength means louder voices and longer arms," she said. "But here we measure strength in something else." She pointed at Ruthie. The little girl had stepped forward and placed herself between the older boys and the sleeping children. Her arms were shaking, her chin trembled, but she didn't move. "She hasn't said 10 words since our mother died," Anna whispered, "but she's never once stepped back when someone needed protection." That broke them, not with guilt, but with shame. The older boys stayed, but they worked, and after a week, they were the ones boiling water for others, reinforcing the stalls with scavenged beams, even teaching the little ones how to whittle pegs from old broom handles. There were still problems. Fights broke out, tempers frayed, food stretched thin, but no one starved, no one froze, no one slept alone in the cold, and the barn endured. Then, just before the 3rd week ended, a rider came. He wore Union blue, though his coat was half shredded and his horse was limping bad. Said he'd been sent from another town. Word of the blizzard had reached as far as the rail line, and relief might be coming in a week's time. He looked half mad from cold, but stared at the barn like it was a chapel. "I heard children were still alive," he muttered. "Didn't believe it." Caleb gave him soup. Anna cleaned his hands. The children swarmed him with questions about the world outside. Before the soldier left, he asked for names. "Of the ones who built this," he said. Caleb didn't answer. Anna just smiled. "Write down the ones who stayed," she said. "That's all." The next day, a wagon came, pulled by a man with a broken nose and 3 toes lost to frostbite. He carried flour, salt, dried meat, said he owed the barn his life. His niece had been among the first children Caleb saved. He called it the place God remembered. More came after, some just to look, others to help. One woman brought a sack of books, saying her cabin had burned, but the schoolhouse might still reopen come spring. She asked if Caleb would help teach the little ones letters. He nodded. He taught them math too, how to ration firewood, how to track time by the angle of shadows, how to survive with nothing, and how to build something from that nothing that others would lean on. One night a preacher came, wanted to hold a sermon, said it was time the town praised the Lord for sparing them. He asked to use the stove as his pulpit. Caleb said no. "This stove saved lives," he said. "It doesn't preach." The preacher left in silence, and the barn stayed full, but Caleb could feel it. The shift, spring would come, the snow was already thinning, birds returned, the roads would clear, men would rebuild their homes and forget the cracks in their pride, and the children would scatter, unless— He looked at Anna one morning just after breakfast. "We don't have to go back," he said. She tilted her head. "We could make it something else," he whispered. "Not just a place we wait out storms in. Not something they forget when the skies clear again." She stared at him. "You mean stay?" "Not just stay," he said. "Build." She nodded once. And that night, after the soup was served and the children were quiet, Caleb stood near the stove and cleared his throat. "I want to tell you all something," he said. 30 sets of eyes turned. "I don't think we were meant to just survive this," he said. "I think we were supposed to learn from it and do something more with it." No one spoke. "But I can't do it alone." He looked at Anna. She stood, then Jonah, then Ruthie, then the older boys, then the teenage girls, then even Barrow, who had returned days earlier, gaunt and quiet and changed. They stood because they remembered the cold, and they remembered who had kept them warm. They started by fixing the roof again. Not because it was leaking, Caleb's patchwork beams had held through the worst of the freeze, but because now that they were staying, he wanted to do it right, so they took it apart slowly, layer by layer. The older boys pulled the rotten shingles and blackened thatch, while Jonah and a few of the younger children peeled tar paper into strips they could reuse for insulation. Anna cut up old dresses and shirts to stuff into the cracks between boards. Someone, maybe Mrs. Tillotson, brought a fresh spool of twine, and the girls used it to braid new lines for hanging quilts. The barn smelled like wood sap and warm ash, a place becoming home. There was no vote, no grand decision. It just became fact. The barn would stay, and so would they. By April, snow still dotted the hills, but it no longer covered the valley floor. The frost line retreated like a memory, and the mud beneath their boots felt like possibility. They found seeds in an old storeroom behind the smithy, carrots, beans, some kind of squash. Caleb and 3 others dug a trench beside the barn to create a runoff ditch, while Anna helped plot out rows using string and salvaged stakes. A girl from the southern edge of town, Josie, maybe 14, too quiet for her age, turned out to have a hand for planting. She took over the garden with a ferocity that made others step back. "Don't walk on the soil," she'd snap. "That's future food you're trampling." And people listened, because spring wasn't just warmth. It was proof they'd survived. More children arrived, even after the roads cleared. Some came from towns miles away, hearing stories about the barn run by orphans, a myth already growing bigger than truth. A boy named Eli said he'd walked 5 days from a mining camp where every adult had frozen or fled. A pair of sisters rode in with a man who refused to give his name, but left them with a single blanket, a tin of beans, and a whispered thank you before disappearing into the trees. Caleb didn't ask questions, he just found them cots. They turned the loft into a dormitory, separating boys and girls with hanging quilts. Someone carved a new outhouse beside the stable ruins. Another found a forgotten iron skillet in the ashes of a collapsed home and brought it to Anna, who scrubbed it clean and made cornbread the next morning. By May, they had over 40 mouths to feed, but they also had a plan. The man with the broken nose returned with a cart full of tools and scrap iron. He helped them build a water catchment system with barrels and rain gutters carved from hollowed logs. Green brought nails. Another man donated a saw. None of them stayed long, but they gave, and gave quietly, because by now the barn had taken on something sacred, a story unfolding in real time. The mayor, the one who'd once threatened to tear it down, came limping through the door one morning in early May. He looked older, humbled. He asked if he could help. Caleb gave him a broom. No speech, no forgiveness, just the work. Anna helped organize the younger children into study groups. She read aloud each evening by lantern light. Old books from ruined shelves, pages torn and scorched, but still holding stories. The little ones listened with wide eyes as she spoke of faraway places, of wild horses and quiet seas and great wars that no blizzard could touch. And for the first time since the storm, they laughed, real laughter, the kind that shakes the ribs loose. Ruthie spoke again, not just one word, but whole sentences, soft and steady. She told a story once, of a dream where her mother came to the barn, smiled, and tucked her in with a quilt made of light. No one corrected her. No one said a thing. They just held her afterward. Even the preacher returned weeks later. He brought a Bible and a bundle of cloth, asked if he could help stitch clothing for the children. Said nothing of sermons, just sat beside Anna and sewed. His stitches were crooked. She didn't fix them. They were his. And then came the rail men, 3 of them, in worn coats and tall boots, walking beside a wagon heavy with flour and blankets. Said they'd heard talk of the barn from a train conductor who swore the children had survived the storm on sheer grit and hay scraps. They asked to see the place. Caleb led them in. They looked around for a long time. "This is," one began. Another finished it. "A miracle." "No," Anna said, "just hard work." They left supplies and a promise. If ever they needed something, a message left at the station would be carried down the line. And so the barn connected, first to the next town, then 2 more, then a nearby camp. They didn't call it an orphanage, they called it the shelter. Some wrote letters asking to send children. Others sent coins or sacks of beans or books wrapped in cloth. One envelope held nothing but 3 seeds and a note that read, "Plant these, they're strong." Caleb planted them by hand. By late summer, the barn had doubled in size. A second wing, built from scavenged logs, rose beside the original. It had no windows yet, but it held warmth. A chimney cobbled together from stone and clay belched smoke beside the old stovepipe. The garden yielded beans, squash, even corn. They built a table long enough for 30, then another, and by the time frost returned to the air in October, the barn stood not just as shelter, but as proof that survival could become something more, that orphans could lead, that broken boards, patched quilts, and bitter soup could hold more power than stone churches or proud homes that forgot to listen. People didn't mock anymore. They wrote letters, asked for help, asked for advice, and sometimes they just came to sit beside the stove, to feel the heat that had kept children alive when grown men had failed. One evening, as snow began to fall again, soft this time, not like a threat but a whisper, Caleb stood outside the barn with Ruthie at his side. She held his hand. "You think it'll be bad again?" she asked. He looked up at the clouds. "No," he said, "not like before." "Why?" "Because now we know how to hold each other up." She nodded, and inside the barn, the stove crackled. A song drifted from the loft, and in the quiet between breaths, you could hear it, the heartbeat of a place built by children, warmed by memory, and held together by every hand that had once been turned away. They mocked the orphans for living in a barn, but when the blizzard came, it was the only place that stood.